Hi there. I'm Steve Himmelweck. I'm your instructor for PHI 150 or Introduction to Philosophy here at Fulton Montgomery Community College by way of the web. And this instructor video is the first of three I will make. I'll make one for each module. Module 1, which is about ancient Greek philosophy and medieval philosophy. Module 2, which is about what they call modern philosophy or the age of enlightened philosophy, basically the period between give or take 1600 and 1800, and then 19th and 20th century philosophy after that. And I'll try to give you a sense of what those modules are about in more detail for each module instructor clip. Just a couple of things about the course in terms of its procedures, I guess more so the workings of it online. Notice that there is a textbook which you can access by way of a table of contents or by way of folders. They these links bring you to the textbook, which has all of the readings either included in it or links to readings to places like the Routledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Encyclopedia Britannica, among others. It also has video clips embedded within it, usually YouTube clips or maybe clips from PBS, like with the first week's reading, or links to film on demand clips from the library, which you'd have to use your MyFM credentials to get into. Basically, when you click on it, it'll prompt you to put those in, and it'll bring you to a basic, I think it's the remote access page for the library. So you go ahead and put in your credentials, and and should bring you right to the film. A couple of other things just about the site to consider in case you haven't figured it out yet. Obviously, the syllabus is up there. There is announcements, which I'll be sending on a pretty regular basis. You can check your grades. You can send messages by way of email or within Blackboard itself. And there's also a help link. More importantly, I think for us, not importantly, but probably more pressingly, is the link that says weekly discussion board, module questions and exams. That's where you'll do those sorts of work. If you go to click on that, you'll see a folder for weekly discussion, and you'll see when you click in there a page that has due dates, a rubric on how I grade the discussions that you can look at as you go through it, and the link to the discussion board. Usually there'll be three parts, sometimes two. So you might be asked to, a typical way this would work is that you'd be asked to create a thread by the Wednesday of a week, then have replied to other students in one way or another by the Friday, and then by the Sunday have replied to any replies or go to another prompt or reevaluate what you had said in your thread, whatever the case might be. So that's what discussions, and those are really geared to create a learning community. Because otherwise, we're sort of living in isolation from one another. We want to feel kind of like we have a class. We do have a class, and we want to be able to communicate with one another and have a sense of a community there where we can interact and have, throw things off each other and feed off each other. And hopefully you found the first week's discussion where you introduced yourselves and said what concerns you about philosophy and what you know about it. Maybe get that ball rolling. And it gives you a chance to, even for those people to whom you didn't respond or didn't respond to you, you can take a look at what other people said in there and sort of get a sense of what your class is about, and you'll get more acquainted with them as we have more discussion. So there are these weekly discussions. This first one, I give you a little bit more time to complete. A, there's no points to it. B, people still enrolling, I think now Wednesday because, when drop ad is. It might be Tuesday, I'm not sure. But usually they'll be due every week, and so that's sort of our regular work in the class. There are also module questions. There are 10 questions for each module, 1, 2, and 3. And again, module 1 being ancient Greek and medieval philosophy, 2, modern or the era of Enlightenment philosophy, and 3, 19th and 20th century philosophy. Those questions are about the readings, about the videos, and about connections between historical context and those the concepts at hand, or by previous philosophers in relation to them as well. And those module questions also have in that folder a page with dates and a rubric, and then there's an exam folder. If you go in there, there's nothing there yet, Um, at the end of each module, the first day of the last week of a module, the exam will open up, and then you have a week to complete it. As a question about each philosopher that we read in the module in there, um, generally speaking. And you can come and go as often as you wish. You can also, I recommend, maybe answer these questions in a document of some sort of Google Doc or Microsoft Word, whatever might be, either cut and paste it in there or attach it. So this way, if you can attach, I'm not sure if you can have the exam questions, so you don't lose your work, in case Blackboard, skits out on you or the internet goes down, whatever the case might be. And so you'll have a week to complete it. You can come and go as often as you want with that until it's due at the end of the week. And just with the module questions, they are open and you could begin to answer them as soon as you want. I highly recommend you don't wait until the final week to get to them because you'll be dealing with the exam as well. So that can make for a pretty hectic week, but that's purely up to you. And by the way, the sooner you answer those module questions, the sooner you get the representative answers for them, which you could find pretty helpful when it comes time to take the exam. So that's your incentive for getting them done sooner than later. Lastly, in terms of the website, obviously the syllabus is up there. Um, and uh, if there are any questions about it, any concerns about getting, working your way through it, please don't hesitate to ask me, and I'll be happy to help out any way I can. Before moving on to, and the point of these videos is to give you a preview of what's coming, what to look for, what to consider, what the learning objectives are, those sorts of things, give you some background to help you out. Um, I do want to just talk a little bit about what Chapter 1 was about. And Discussion 1, of course, was introducing yourself for the most part. And just so you know, the Getting Started portion of the semester, Chapter 1, these are not graded assignments. You will not have to know this material specifically. In other words, you won't be examined on it. There won't be content questions about them, just so you know. But they're really important. There's the part about the value of philosophy, and there's a piece from Bertrand Russell about that, which I think is useful to take a look at. Basically, there's a link to that piece by him about the value of philosophy, and then the actual write-up in the textbook itself, brings up some questions and issues related to it, some quotes and summaries from it. But that's what that's about. But more importantly is actually the first um, portion of that chapter, which is about what is philosophy generally and a little bit more specifically. You'll see on that page is a breakdown of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, and then there's links to the Rutland Encyclopedia of Philosophy about political philosophy and philosophy of religion, and a couple of videos. One from PBS, which is embedded in there, called "What is Philosophy?" Crash Course Philosophy. That's the name of the series. It's really well done. It's easy to listen to. It's a little bit humorous, cartoony, so that's kind of fun. And then there's one called "What is Philosophy?" which comes from Films on Demand, and that's where you would have to sign in with your FM credentials to access it. And I do want to mention one thing about this particular portion of that chapter, which would be important moving forward. And that is, so basically, philosophy can be thought of a number of things. I think at the most basic level, it's, well, why are things as they are? How are things as they are? Um, but when you think about it in terms of its major areas, I think it makes it clearer. And you'll see that, so there are 5 areas covered in this unit. They represent the 5 areas we'll really be dealing with during this semester, and there are more too. In addition to epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, philosophy of religion, and political philosophy, there's aesthetics, philosophy of art, and there's uh, philosophy of science, of the mind. It goes on and on. But these are the 3 areas, and I would argue actually that 2 of them are more major than the other 3, or the basis for the other 3 to exist. Let me explain. I think this will be important to know moving forward. I think first will be metaphysics. And metaphysics asks, well, what is reality? What is real? What is it to be a being? A human being or a being at all? Where would the world come from? Where would beings come from? What's the end point of beings, right? What's the goal if there is one? Where do we fit into the world? These are very, very big picture questions, and that's what metaphysics deals with. Equally large, the second of those really large areas and most important areas is epistemology. And this is the question about knowledge. What can we know? What can't we know? How can we come to know things? What things can't we come to know, and why not? And so I think these are the two major, most all-encompassing areas because if you think about ethics, which is the study of what we should or should not do, what's right or wrong, good and bad, how to live the good life, and we actually teach a course here on ethics at FM as well. So it'll be offered in this, sometimes offered during the summer, sometimes offered during the semester, both online and um, in the classroom. But how could you answer a question about what is good or bad without knowing, well, what is real and what's not real to begin with? What can we know? What can't we know? So it seems to me that oftentimes, well, ethics is oftentimes talked about as one of the big three. I tend to think about it as the first of the others. That's just a personal opinion. It doesn't really mean much of anything. Uh, Political philosophy is about the idea of what makes the ideal state. What should a state look like? What how should it be legislated? What should the people who run the country, what are their responsibilities? What rights do we have? What don't we have? Those sorts of questions. And then there's philosophy of religion, which asks theological questions such as what is the nature of God? What's God's plan? How can we know God? Or actually, philosophy of religion goes to be atheistic about why there's why we can't know God. And I guess that atheistic idea leads into really what philosophy of religion is about, which is it will also ask, does God exist or does God not exist? And can we know if God exists or can we not? Meaning, a theologist wouldn't ask those questions, but a philosopher of religion would. And you will see that St. Thomas of Aquinas and St. Anselm, who you'll read in the first module, in fact, ask those questions. Of course, they answer in the affirmative. But an atheistic approach or agnostic approach is also, believe it or not, philosophy of religion because it asks about the existence of God. Okay, so I think those are important things to know, those basic areas of philosophy, because there are times I'll talk about, the epistemological foundations of something, or what's the metaphysic behind this, right? So you want to know what those things mean as we head into it, and oftentimes what the connections between them are, we'll be looking to get to. And I think you'll see that immediately in the week number 2 discussion, which asks you to look at Plato's Allegory of the Cave to read it, and you'll also see there's some videos related to Plato. I hope you do watch the videos; they can be really helpful, and I might draw material from there too. But while Plato's Allegory of the Cave is oftentimes looked at as something that's really more about epistemology, knowledge, I want to say it's also about metaphysics too, and I'm looking for you to make that connection. And I'll get into that a little bit more here in a second. So before getting specifically at any of the specific philosophers, um, note that the first part of chapter 2 has learning objectives, and one of the first learning objective asks you to understand and be able to assess the impact of Greek culture and thought on philosophy generally and on Plato and Aristotle. So you'll see that the first bit of content are links to another online textbook which I've used before for introduction to ethics, to ethical studies, and uh, so they give you a sense of Greek culture and the importance of myth, of Homer and Hesiod, that sort of thing. A bit about their culture, what they consider important, and uh, also um, about even how theater and culture plays into this. And this is important because before Plato and Aristotle, and when we say Plato, we're also talking about Socrates. Socrates was Plato's teacher, and the first half of Plato's philosophy is Socratic. It's from Socrates. But there's this group of people called the pre-Socratics, which you'll read a little bit about, and they sort of really began to think about how can one logically and scientifically know the world. So it came from mythology, but it was a reaction against it, saying, well, you say these myths are the way they are, but let's try to look with our senses. Let's think logically and see if we can't come up with some answers that right are more solidified or are sort of more hold more weight behind them as a result. And so, they were looking to get at those sorts of things about how the world works. And that's what leads to Plato and Aristotle really creating coherent and pretty intricate, metaphysical and or epistemological, even ethical and political systems. Um, And the influence of the Greek philosophy on philosophy and the world is immense. I mean, Aristotle and Plato are still considered probably the most important philosophers of all time. You might put Kant up there, maybe even Descartes and Hume, but certainly Aristotle and Plato. Albert North Whitehead, who was a philosopher in the 20th or early part of the 20th century and a scientist, said that all philosophy is just a footnote to Plato. So that's how important these sorts of folks were. And they set the groundwork for what are the different types of government that exist, which ones would work better or maybe are the best period. What constitutes a good life? What would it mean to live a good life, to live ethically? What is good or bad? What are the roles of the gods or of God, if there is one? What makes something an instance of great art and why so much is function? So it's questions like that. So it's philosophical, but also about the world in which we live in. So it's really important that we have a sense of that. And you'll see module questions will ask you about the connection between Greek thought and culture and mythology to the works of Plato and Aristotle. So as for Plato, he's often considered the father of Western philosophy. He did create the first true philosophical system in the West. And as I mentioned, his early work was Socratic. Why? That was his teacher, and he wanted to provide Socrates' philosophy to everybody because Socrates had been forced to drink hemlock. He was tried by Greek tribunal because supposedly he was corrupting the minds of Athenian youth. Really, what was happening, of course, is that the powers that be weren't very happy with what he was teaching. So, but once you get to the middle of his intellectual life, he begins to form his own philosophy. And what you're going to read, this allegory of the cave, is from his probably his most famous text called the Republic. And the Republic is a text that seeks to set forth what the ideal state would be, why it should be run by a philosopher king, of course, right? What else would it be? And what's involved with making that happen. And so the allegory of the cave is part of that larger argument. So it's a political argument, but it's also an argument about what we can know and what reality is. And I think it's important to have a sense of what is real in order to get at why he thinks something like he calls the idea or the capital I is really the basis of all knowledge. And I'll leave it to you for to look at. But notice in the reading, the Allegory of the Cave, the I is capitalized. If you read it last week, it wasn't capitalized. That was a mistake, and I changed that. But that's an important thing to keep in mind. It relates to the idea of what's called his theory of forms. There's some video about that, some reading about that by way of links and by text within the textbook. So hope you read that because I think it's very, very helpful and important. And keep in mind that this allegory of the cave is an allegory, so it's metaphorical. You want to keep in mind what things like chains and shadows and suns and the sun and fire and the stair leading out of the cave, what the cave itself might mean, right? And also keep in mind it's a dialogue. It's a dialogue between people, between characters, and um, that's his way of getting at the Socratic method, which is really what Socrates and Plato call the dialectic, meaning we keep asking questions, eliminate what can't be, what doesn't work, to get to, if not what's right, at least what's left. And so you might find that a little bit strange reading that sort of back and forth in that dialogue, but hopefully you'll be able to get through it with not too much difficulty. Now, Aristotle is quite different than Plato. He was the student of Plato. He studied at his academy. But Aristotle really went in a very different direction. Uh, Plato's theories of forms is very idealistic philosophy. It's very mystic. These forms that always exist, always already. They're static. They're unchanging, and all knowledge has already existed, and we actually just re-access it. He even believed in reincarnation and things like that. So, and basically, Plato believed that the world itself, right, is just at best a copy of what is real, and maybe at times a copy of a copy of a copy. So he wanted to get as close to those true forms as we could. Aristotle kind of took issue with this because he thought, okay, well, if things are end directed toward what Plato would call the good, meaning we want to know what's good, what's the good life, what's the good state, what's good knowledge, so forth and so on. Well, these things seem to change. They seem to exist in the particulars we see in the world, and they change. And how can we understand that change and may even make sense of it, even have that if there's eternal forms who exist already? It seems to be a contradiction. So he's going to say things that, in fact, form, like there's no eternal forms. Form is something that exists as a potential. When matter comes together in different combinations, you get form and it creates a substance. And so uh, he really wants us to know what the essence of these particular things are, meaning we can know what combines to make something what it is, and then we can go from there to look at larger picture things. And the excerpt you're going to read is from what's called the physics, and it is about matter and motion, but it's just as much about metaphysics, about what allows for matter to exist and for matter to move and how we can study it. So in the physics, you're going to read quite a bit about these four causes he talks about and how they sort of become the basis for, well, the physical world itself, metaphysically speaking. It's the preconditions in a way for matter to be in motion and how we can study matter in motion, what things are, and to get a better sense of the bigger picture world. He's an empiricist, meaning he wanted to look at what the senses told him to get a sense of what's real, as well as what the rational mind said. Um, and he'll be different in that he will suggest there is, in this you won't be reading about specifically, but there is no ideal government. It can vary from situation to situation. Um, what's virtuous is to him what mattered in terms of what's ethical. That meaning we want to be as well functioning as we can, and the better functioning you are, it's a very empirical, right, scientific way of looking at things, means you're able to live a better life. You will do good. You will be good. You're more likely to do good as a result. And he actually offers a theory of creation called the unmoved mover, which I'm not going to get into it, but basically it's the ultimate, eternal, necessary substance and first cause of things in the cosmos. And it's from there that all things, it's not God, so to speak. It didn't create everything from nothing. It took matter and put it into motion. You take that out and start with something that creates everything from nothing, you get the Christian God. So he's sort of the basis, right? This unmoved mover is the basis for that. So Aristotle is incredibly important. Plato will be more important initially in Christian slash medieval thought, but Aristotle will become more important down the line. And that transitions us into medieval philosophy. Um, Medieval philosophy is dominated by religion, what will eventually be called the scholastic era. So, as I mentioned, it starts out very Neoplatonist, and that's what we'll see in St. Anselm's theory. And then the work of Aristotle will become integrated more and more because of Aquinas. And the reason why Aristotle becomes integrated more is because he was sort of not as well known in the West. His works had been destroyed by the church. There wasn't much exposure to much of his work until um, interaction with other cultures through trade, uh, through exploration, and also through conquest. The Moors, who who were Arabs, they invaded successfully Spain and ruled it for 2 centuries or so. And they had the work of Aristotle and Averroes, among other philosophers, had studied Aristotle and presented theories about it. So that's where someone like Aquinas got it, and Aristotle becomes really the important figure moving on from the 13th century. And I tell you all this because one of the content questions will ask you to think about the connection between Aristotle and Plato to Aquinas and Anselm, um, respectively. So with Anselm, he's what would be called a Neoplatonist. And Neoplatonists sort of believe that there's this one, the good, as Plato would have called it, from which all things emanate. It's a theory of emanation, what it's called. And then he believed there's this concept called nous, which was the perfect image of the one, an archetype of all existing things. It's sort of like, what about the good, the one, about God we can possibly know? It's being and thought at the same time. And this is pretty weird stuff, I know, but this is sort of where we're headed. Um, And so it's the highest sphere of the human mind that we can attain to. It sort of gets a pure intellect itself. And then there's the world soul, which is uh, sort of the immaterial image and product of that nous, if you will. So basically, there's the intelligible world. Um, it's the world in which of things we can see and perceive, where nous is really pure thought. And that leads to the phenomenal world. That's the world of stuff, of matter, right? And there is no idea with a capital I attached to it. It doesn't partake in the one or the form or the good, um, unless one has a good soul and can connect it to it as such. This is more information than you probably need about this, but the point is for Anselm, um, it'll help you understand that he's a Neoplatonist in a sense, and he's offering an ontological argument for God's existence. Very much a rationalist, Platonist, idealist argument for it. It's not really empirically based. And you'll see he's a pretty important and controversial figure, at least during his time. And in his Encyclopedia Britannica article, that'll give you a bit about that. Uh, Aquinas, on the other hand, is arguing against Neoplatonists in many ways, and probably the most influential Christian philosopher of all time. Maybe Augustine might be as influential. It's up for debate. And his Neo-Aristotelian argument argues that the existence of God can be proven empirically through the senses. And he's going to offer 5 ways of doing that. So the first two articles of it are really about his arguments against the Neoplatonists, about why their arguments fall short. And then his 5 ways are going to be the ways to potentially prove God. He doesn't say he can, that he does. He's saying that these are proofs that can lead one to do that in the empirical world, in the world of sight, sense, smell, taste, feel, touch. So, and this becomes really important in the context of philosophy, of religion moving forward. So with all that, this is a pretty long video, and it's because I was also doing module 1 and sort of orientating us to the course. So the next 2 should be quite a bit shorter, hopefully about half the length or so. But hopefully you found this helpful. And again, please look for it in the link on the left-hand toolbar of Blackboard. That'll say instructor videos. And again, if you have any questions, any concerns, please contact me by email or Blackboard or phone, or come see me in my office. I'll be happy to talk with you and try to talk you through whatever I can. And I really look forward to reading what you guys have to write and looking at your discussions and your answers to module questions and exam questions as we go through the semester. And I hope you find it enjoyable and above all, educational.